Let's listen in now to some of the comments that we were able to access from that bilateral.
Prime Minister Modi, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you to the beautiful coastal city of Xiamen in China for the 9th BRICS Summit. Over the past couple of days, we have had in-depth exchanges and reached broad consensus on BRICS cooperation as well as on other major international and regional issues. China stands ready to work with all the other members of the BRICS countries to follow through on the outcomes of the Xiamen Summit so as to jointly usher in a new prospect of BRICS cooperation.
中印互为重要邻国，也是两个最大的发展中国家和新兴市场国家。一个健康稳定的中印关系符合两国人民根本利益，也是本地区和国际社会的共同期待。中方愿同印方一道，以共同倡导的和平共处等原则为指导，增进政治互信，推进台湾合作，推动中印关系正确的发展。
China and India are each other's major neighbors. We are also at the same time two of the world's largest developing and emerging countries. A healthy and stable China-India relationship serves the fundamental interests of the people of both countries. It is also the shared expectation of our region and the international community. China is prepared to work with India to seek guidance from Panchashila, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a joint initiative between our two countries to enhance our political mutual trust, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, and in this way ensure that our bilateral relationship will make further advancement along the right course.
ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन की सफलता के लिए मैं आपको, आपकी पूरी टीम को हृदय से बहुत बहुत बधाई देना चाहता हूं। मैं समझता हूं कि तेज गति से बदलते वैश्विक परिवेश में ब्रिक्स को और अधिक प्रासंगिक बनाने में यह शिखर सम्मेलन सचमुच में बहुत सफल हुआ है।
阁下，我们的这个团这次受到了热情的接待和周到的安排，我对此先向您表示感谢。我很高兴再次有机会跟您会见。这次的中央峰会圆满成功，对此我向您和您的代表团表示祝贺。现在的世界有迅速的变化，在这个背景下，金砖国家要加强合作，在这一方面，这次的峰会发挥了非常重要的作用。
मुझे याद है कि गोवा के ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन की खुशियां और सफलता के लिए चीन से और व्यक्तिगत तौर पर
Right, so that meeting has taken place between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We're waiting for the Ministry of External Affairs press briefing to get a closer understanding of what all was discussed at the meeting. But some of the information is filtering in. For instance, we believe reportedly there was a comment by President Xi Jinping in which he brought up the Panchsheel Pact, saying that China was prepared to work with India to seek guidance from the 5 principles of Panchsheel. Now, just for the uninitiated, those 5 principles, as stated by the Panchsheel Treaty signed April 29, 1954, are 1. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and cooperation for mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Some interesting factors being brought up by President Xi Jinping. We'll try and make sense of what that means given the current situation between India and China post Doklam in just a bit. But just to remind our viewers, the Prime Minister has also conducted bilateral meetings with the President of Egypt earlier this morning. This, of course, part of the engagement that the Prime Minister had with some of the BRICS Plus countries that were in attendance at the Xiamen Summit. They included Mexico, Egypt, Guinea, Tajikistan and Thailand. Now, Prime Minister Modi arrived at Xiamen for the group photo op of BRICS leaders on day 3 of the summit. He later attended the BRICS Emerging Markets Dialogue, where he spoke about the duty of BRICS nations in making a sovereign world, brick by brick. He also stressed on the need to create an inclusive, digital, skilled and a healthy world. Joining me live on the broadcast is WION senior editor Surya Gangadharan. He is at the international desk. Surya, so the meeting is done. We're waiting to hear from the MEA in that press briefing for a little more clarity on what all was talked about. But if I could go off on what I'm reading in online about the reference to the Panchsheel Pact, do you find that interesting, given that some of the key components of the Panchsheel Pact reference things like sovereignty, territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression? These are interesting points given what's happened at Doklam recently.
Well, Panchsheel was a long time ago, and the principles still apply to both countries. But China has also changed, transformed in many ways. And what we are seeing today is a far cry from the China of those days. This is a very nationalist China. It's a world player now. It's a major economy. It has huge military capabilities, and I think we saw some measure of that during the Doklam standoff, at least in terms of the kind of response we were getting from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the threats, the intimidation. Of course, the Chinese media, sections of the Chinese media also joined in. So in that sense, thankfully, the standoff is over. But I think we need to closely study how the bilateral went off to be able to get a sense of where we are going forward. I have no doubt that some of the gains already made in terms of our trade, our political ties, those will remain. But the irritants need to be addressed. We have a trade deficit with China. China doesn't seem to be doing anything to address that.
Right.
China's relationship with Pakistan. There's so many of these irritants on the table.
Absolutely. And you did say earlier when we were chatting that Doklam specifically perhaps will not come up in this meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. Broad strokes, of course, there's going to be conversation on many things. But doesn't the devil lie in the details, Surya? And especially when India and China have had a difficult relationship in the past, even though it might have come to a successful resolution at Doklam, that perhaps might not be the case every time in the future as well.
Well, I think it's important that the two leaders do talk about these issues, but obviously they are heads of state, heads of government. They're not going to get into details. Those details will be handled by their delegation. Foreign Secretary Jaishankar was there, National Security Advisor Doval was there, you have the Indian Ambassador to China, you have similar officials from the Chinese side, and as we're aware, there has been exchange of officials from both sides visiting each other's capitals ahead of BRICS. So there's been ample time and opportunity to look at all those irritants and see where we can go forward, how to get around them, perhaps tweak some of those framework agreements that we have built, and over the years we really have to see how really the details are worked out and how the two sides see each other, and how this relationship must go forward and not be bound down by all those little problems we have on the ground, whether in terms of border disputes or the trade deficit.
Absolutely. I know you're reluctant to talk about optics, but I'm still going to ask you a question on that because, you know, symbolism has become sort of part and parcel of engagement between world leaders. President Trump's handshake, for instance, Prime Minister Modi's bear hugs. This time too, I mean, forget about the fact that there was no warm, you know, hugging or anything, but there was a handshake. There were lots of smiles going around. But more importantly, the fact that these two leaders are together on the same platform, when there was this whole threat of India might deciding or might choosing to you know, not go ahead with BRICS this time around, that did hang heavy over China and the Xiamen summit. Do you think, keeping that in mind, the fact that you know, we're seeing these visuals of these two gentlemen shaking hands does make a bit of a difference?
I think it was a business-like meeting between them. The handshake was firm on all sides, if we're going to look at the body language part of it. I think what's more important is what they discussed and what comes out of this. Because really, India and China have to move forward. Doklam can't be the stone that kind of ties them down, you know. There are a lot of things to discuss, a lot of stuff on the table, lots of irritants. We have to get around those irritants and move forward. And really, in that sense, that's why this bilateral was so important, you know. What the two leaders decide, the directions they give to their delegations on how to take the relationship forward, what are the issues they want to raise. I think these are the points that really need to be considered now.
Mutually speaking, Surya, which is the pest number one, which is the biggest irritant facing both of them?
Well, I do believe the trade deficit is a major one, and I think even the Chinese are concerned by India's move to levy tariffs on some of their imports. 90-odd imports were mentioned, I recall reading some of those reports. And there's also the border dispute, of course, that's been there for a long time. Transgressions, I understand, are increasing. These need to be dealt with and checked. Therefore, the border needs to be demarcated. There is no sign from the Chinese that they're willing to address that in all these years. And of course, there's this whole issue of China and Pakistan, the kind of relationship they've evolved, China's support for Pakistan, even in terms of backing terrorists like Masood Azhar.
Right.
So these are issues for us.
What about CPEC and OBOR?
I think the point here is that India has made clear its objections to CPEC and OBOR. It will not join OBOR. It's made that very clear. And when one looks at it, you know, the points that we raised about sustainability and transparency in terms of how you approach these big initiatives, I think those are valid and they need to be addressed by the Chinese. And also the fact that, you know, the Chinese have a lot of foreign exchange reserves over there. If they want to bleed in terms of OBOR, that's up to them. But we can reserve the right to stay away from it and only pick and choose what we want.
Okay, so we're counting down, of course, Surya, to the MEA's press briefing, which is expected to get underway very shortly. But I want to go back to that report of, you know, the Panchil Treaty and the reference that President Xi Jinping made to it in the bilateral. One of the things that's mentioned, of course, one of the 5 points is mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. And does that extend, though? I mean, when we're looking at CPEC, for instance, it runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. India says that this is its sovereign territory. The fact that CPEC goes through POK is a violation, and it is an interference in that sense in our internal affairs. How do you see, you know, these kinds of, you know, minute things finding a platform, let's say, in the conversation that's taking place between the two leaders?
I think in the pursuit of national power and national interests, you know, you use whatever levers you have to put the other on the defensive, your adversaries or perceived adversaries. And that's what the Chinese do. They have the power, they have the resources, they have the money, and they have the will. The only point is sometimes it comes up short, as in Doklam, when they never anticipated, I'm given to understand, they never anticipated the manner in which India would react. So I think that was a lesson for the Chinese. Probably they are redoing some of their lessons about India, and in that sense they'll be a little more cautious next time. But the problems are there on the table. These can't be wished away. China will do what it wants to do to pursue its own national interests. And as far as we can see now, Pakistan is a useful tool to leverage those interests and to leverage those initiatives. So they will use Pakistan to the extent possible, but pull back whenever they feel that maybe things are getting out of control or things are going in a direction which they never anticipated. So that is something we have to live with. We have to find our own counters to that, and that's really the challenge for India.
Okay, so when it comes to Doklam, though, Surya, you know, we talked about it for 73 days non-stop, and we're still talking about it even after the resolution. And you had mentioned once that it was as much as a test for Prime Minister Modi and his leadership here in India. It was an equal test for President Xi Jinping, given that the National People's Congress is coming up as well. So if we are to look at the sort of let's say the report card that both leaders received after the resolution of Doklam, do you think President Xi Jinping has received equal points as Prime Minister Modi has back here in India?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the manner in which India behaved on Doklam has added to the sense that India is an emerging power in its own right. It is a mature power, it is responsible, it understands issues like asymmetry, it understands where it is right and what is wrong. And more than anything else, it has come to the aid of a smaller country that is a neighbor. And we didn't blink when the Chinese resorted to the kind of threats and intimidation that they did. So these are valuable lessons. The entire world was watching. Let's not deny the fact that the world was watching. They've seen how India behaved. I think there are lessons here for China too, that at some point they may face up to the same kind of standoff or wall, perhaps somewhere in the South China Sea or somewhere else where it's trying to bulldoze its way through. So India has come off well. I think Prime Minister Modi's prestige at this BRICS summit was really enhanced. He had acquired a new stature. I think there was a lot of respect for him. I think even on the Chinese side, there is recognition that you can't push India too far. This is maybe a smaller country, smaller resources, smaller economy, but you can't push them.
All right. And speaking of the fact that China might have been blindsided by India's position on Doklam, and right after that you have Kim Jonghoon choosing to detonate that nuclear bomb on Sunday, the day that BRICS began. So that was in some ways a double whammy for President Xi Jinping. Yes,
I'm sure he never anticipated either. And even Doklam, frankly, it was not the president who initiated this. May have been some local level official who did it. But the blowback was kept at the national level in both capitals. I think similarly in the case of North Korea, maybe the Chinese had some hint perhaps that this gentleman would do something dramatic. They would have had some insight into his development of atomic devices, even the hydrogen bomb that he set off. Perhaps they were not quite convinced that he would do it in the manner in which he did ahead of the BRICS visit. So yes, a bit of an embarrassment there. Pressure on China, renewed pressure on China, especially by the US, to get the North Koreans to the table to denuclearize and to talk. But I think China knows how far it can push the North Koreans. They know them extremely well. And they know that beyond a point, the North Koreans will not listen. So you'll find that both the Chinese and the Russians are on the same table when they tell the Americans to stop military exercises with South Korea and come to the table with the North and negotiate. Right. What the North Koreans want is to negotiate directly with the Americans.
Okay. We've spoken at length, Surya, about India and China. It's been front and center of our discussions ever since BRICS kicked off. But there was this other very important bilateral that took place, and that was between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. And I ask you this question because last time around at the Goa summit, a lot was made about this relationship between India and Russia, a re-establishment, a refurbishment of a decades and decades old relationship between the two countries. Do you think it's taken a bit of a backseat this time around, given the India-China rhetoric and the concentration on that particular meeting?
I think the India-Russia relationship has been heavily state to state, government to government. There is not much of a people connect. I think that's one of the problems there. Also, the levels of trade, although we do well in terms of nuclear energy cooperation and defense has come down a bit, but they're still very, very substantial in terms of our armed forces and the equipment that they use. But I think we do need to find ways to shore up this relationship, especially the strategic aspect, which is because Russia is now isolated by the US, by Europe. It is having to move closer to the Chinese to shore up its own position. We see a change in the Russian direction on Pakistan and Afghanistan. These are concerns for us. It's a good point that we are talking to them about it. I'm sure this would have been discussed between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin, not for the first time. I'm sure they would have discussed this earlier also. We really have to see where we can find a way around this. Okay,
speaking of two specific things as far as Russia goes, last year, if you remember, Surya, Russia too didn't exactly look too amenable to including specific names of terror organizations in the declaration from the Goa summit. Thereafter, after President Trump's comments on his new Afghanistan and South Asia strategy, Russia came to Islamabad's defense. Would it be fair to say that Russia's attitude in that sense when looking at India is one that seems to be blowing hot, blowing cold at this point in time?
No, I think Russia is looking at its own interests. It is worried about the blowback from all those Russian citizens who have gone to fight on behalf of the Islamic State in Syria and other places. And they are worried that these people come back, they'll come to the Russia's soft underbelly, which is Central Asia. They want these guys to be stopped even before they enter, which is why they've decided that they need to reach out to Pakistan. Pakistan has the best equation with the Taliban, and the Taliban is opposed to the Islamic State. So in that convoluted rather manner, they find a need to talk to the Taliban and reach out to Pakistan. It's something which Russia will do regardless of the relationship with India. There may be an element of trying to offset India's own growing ties to the Americans. That's something which cannot be denied. But the fact is, India and Russia also need each other. And we need to keep talking and need to build up our relations wherever there are gaps and wherever there are perceived, limitations and deficiencies.
Okay, we'll leave it at that, Surya, for now. We've talked at length about what may be. We'll have to wait and hear from the Ministry of External Affairs to figure out the exact points of conversation in that bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. We'll get back to you, Surya, for more on that in just a bit. But for a quick recap for our viewers who are just tuning in, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping conducted that first and substantive bilateral meeting after the Doklam standoff at Xiamen at the BRICS summit earlier today. And that meeting between the two of them began at 10:30 a.m. And during those talks, Prime Minister Modi did congratulate the Chinese president for the successful execution of the 9th BRICS summit. Speaking at the bilateral, President Xi said that stable India-China relations are in the interest of both countries. He added that India and China are each other's major neighbors and two of the world's largest and emerging countries. Delegation-level talks were held amid efforts by both India and China to leave behind the bitterness that was caused by the 73-day Doklam standoff. According to sources, India and China's delegations also discussed ways to create confidence-building measures. Many outstanding issues, including border demarcation, trade deficit, were discussed in that meeting. The Xiamen Declaration, which explicitly names Pakistan-based terror groups like the Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed and implored joint BRICS action against terror, was considered a big win for Indian diplomacy and, of course, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in particular. This is expected to put more pressure on China to act against Masood Azhar. If you remember, China has repeatedly blocked India's attempts to have the UN designate Masood Azhar as a global terrorist.